Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Kataksha Kirana Chanta Naman Mohabdaye Namaha Anantananda Krishnaya Jagan Mangala Murtaye. Very good. All right, welcome back to our webcast of our Tuesday night Vedanta class on Advaita Makaranda. As we've already discussed in some length, Advaita Makaranda is an advanced text mostly focused on manana and nididhyasana, which we've talked about at some length. And the purpose of it is it's focused on the ultimate truth of Vedanta. In other words, the manana and nididhyasana undertaken in Lakshmidhara's text, Advaita Makaranda, is not focused on tangential aspects of Advaita Vedanta. He focuses on the essence of Vedantic teachings, the epitome of Vedantic teachings. And as you already know quite well, the essence of Vedantic teachings can be communicated in 3 words, tat, tvam, asi. And we saw this at the end of the previous class. I want to return to this point. It'll also introduce today's verse very nicely. Something we really need to see clearly in what happens, or I should say how we equate the words tat, that, and tvam, you. Let me show you on the board. So the essence of Vedanta is almost mathematical, to equate tat and tvam. Now, remember the meaning of these terms. And these terms are used in highly technical ways. Tat is just a pronoun that, tvam is another pronoun you, but in the expression tat tvamasi, these 2 words have highly refined meanings. Tat means the underlying reality because of which everything exists, Brahman. Tvam means you in general, but you in the essential way, the underlying reality because of which you exist. And as we've discussed at great length, that final reality of who you are as a conscious being is consciousness. Now, what's unique about the expression tat tvamasi is it equates the reality because of which the universe exists and that conscious reality because of which you exist. Now, independently, it's not terribly difficult to understand that there must be an underlying reality because of which the universe exists, just like clay exists just like a pot exists depending on clay. We're standing here, I should use another metaphor. Just like this cloth exists depending on threads, everything exists depending on some underlying reality. And the ultimate underlying reality because of which the cosmos exists is Brahman. That underlying reality is indicated by the word tat. Then, with regard to you, the underlying reality because of which you exist is also not that hard to understand. You are a conscious being. When you say, I am, the ultimate meaning of that phrase is not your body, not your mind, not your senses, not the prana life force. The ultimate meaning when you say I am is you as a conscious being. you as consciousness. Individually, to understand Tat and understand Twam is not difficult if you have the help of Vedantic teachings. But to understand the identity of these two is the ultimate teaching of Vedanta. That's the highest vision of Vedanta. This is the knowledge in which you finally gain enlightenment. Knowledge of Tat is partial. Knowledge of Twam is partial. Discovery of the identity is what Vedanta is ultimately meant for. Now, how is that identity discovered? That's where we left off at the end of the last class, where I said that the term Tat in the Taittiriya Upanishad, there is a wonderful, very simple, as though definition for Brahman. And that definition is Satyam Jnanam Anantam. What it means is that Brahman, Tat, that underlying reality because of which everything exists, is Satyam. It is real. It's not something that comes and goes. It's not something that undergoes transformation. It's uncreated and unchanging. The word Satyam means both uncreated and unchanging. And further, that underlying reality because of which everything exists is jnanam. Now, as I pointed out last week, in this statement, jnanam doesn't mean knowledge. Conventionally, jnanam means knowledge. Here, it means consciousness. We understand that from context. Also, the commentators all make it very clear. So jnana means consciousness, and the reason that's so important is that the underlying reality, because of which everything exists, can't be mere inert existence, because the universe is filled with intelligence, filled with consciousness. So the underlying reality because of which the universe exists must account not only for the existence of the universe, but it has to account for the intelligence found throughout the universe. So therefore, that Tat, that Brahman, is not only Satyam, uncreated, unchanging, sheer reality, existence itself. That's a nice expression. Pure existence and pure knowledge in the sense of consciousness, pure knowledge in the sense of intelligence, the intelligence that pervades the universe, the intelligence because of which planets go around their stars. You get the point. And finally, this Satyam and Jnanam are both Anantam, boundaryless, limitless, vast, infinite, Anantam. Perfect word. So we have this three-word definition of Tat, or Brahman. Then we have another three-word definition for Atma, Twam. And that three-word definition, several questions came up with regard to that equivalence that we talked about at the end of the last class. So I'm coming back to it. And as I said, it'll also introduce today's verse very nicely. So that definition of Twam, or Atma, is, as you know, Sat, Chit, Ananda. This is the Satyam Jnanam Anantam is the reality because of which the universe exists. Sat Chit Ananda is the reality because of which you exist. And the equivalence is Satyam is equivalent to Sat. Sat is pure existence, the existence because of which you exist as a conscious being. Pure existence, uncreated and unchanging. Similarly, Chit The equivalence of chit and jnanam is obvious, consciousness. The equivalence that's not so obvious is between anantam and ananda. And this question frequently comes up because most people have the wrong definition of ananda. Ananda is almost always translated as bliss, and bliss is an experience, commonly understood. Bliss is something you experience when I eat chocolate ice cream. I happen to like it. I experience a kind of a bliss. I admit it. But how long does that bliss last? So it begins when I start eating the ice cream, and very quickly it's over. That which comes and goes, and that which is experienced by me cannot be my true nature, Atma. So you see the defect. And we talked about this in great length in our Atma Bodha classes. Hopefully you've watched those. If you haven't watched those, I highly encourage you to do so. It'll help you understand this text. So therefore, to translate ananda as bliss is absolutely erroneous. Bliss is an experience. We're talking about you, not an experience. Your essential nature, not some kind of chocolate experience. So therefore, how shall we translate ananda? Well, here's a really good translation, ananta. And honestly, in many, many commentaries, the commentator will use the expression for Atma, Sat Chit Ananta Ananda. They'll add that word ananta to this expression, Sat Chit Ananda, to remind everyone that ananda really means ananta. Now, ananda means bliss. How do you get from bliss to limitlessness? Nice. When I eat the ice cream, I forget about everything else. I just enjoy the ice cream. When you forget about everything else, there's a kind of limitlessness involved in that blissful experience. This is a connection. Because a kind of limitlessness is present in every experience of ananda, the word ananda is used to express your essential limitlessness. When I'm eating ice cream, I lose consciousness of the body, lose consciousness of the mind. I'm talking about in a blissful experience, and maybe perhaps a meditative experience would be better than ice cream. But anyway, you get the point. In a profoundly blissful experience, you no longer are aware of the limitations of your body, limitations of your mind, limitations of your senses and prana. And as those limitations fade from your awareness, what remains is your true self, which is limitless. When the limitations of your body, mind, and senses fade away in the experience of ananda, what remains is the limitless, which is your limitlessness, which is your true nature. Okay. Now, one last part, just to show this idea of equivalence. These two things are equated, which means satyam jnanam anantam is Satchidananda. That's what this tad equal tvam means. So here's I don't know if this is clever or stupid. I'll let you make the judgment. Try this. If we have two equations, 1 plus 2 plus 3, and we'll say that equals x. Then we're still showing up on the board, yes. Let's try another equation. How about 2? What did I actually figured this out in advance because I want to make a point. How about 3 minus 2 plus the square root of 4, how's that? Plus 12 divided by 4 equals y. Notice in these two equations, there's an equivalence. 1 is equivalent to 3 minus 2. 2 is equivalent to the square root of 4. 3 is equivalent to 12 divided by 4. Since each of these terms are equivalent, x must equal y. This is the principle of equivalence I spoke about at the end of the last class. And you're going to see it really predominantly in the very next verse. Our author, Lakshmidhara, uses this principle of equivalence, comparing Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma to Satchit Ananda, showing how they're equivalent. And by showing they're equivalent, you arrive at their identity. Okay. Are we back? Yes. Okay, we are ready for the next verse. Mayevo deti chedvyomni. Repeat. Mayevo deti chedvyomni. Jagad Gandharva Pattanam. Jagad Gandharva Pattanam. Atoham nakatam brahma. Atoham nakatam brahma. Sarvajñam sarvakaranam. Sarvajñam sarvakaranam. Let's just see the first half of the verse first. It says, Jagat, in the second line, the world, Jagat. What about the world? Is the first, at the beginning, all these words are run together. Mayi eva udeti. You have to break the words apart. Mayi eva udeti. Jagat, the world, udeti, arises. Arises where? Mayi eva. In me alone. The world arises, Jagat, the world, udeti, arises, Mayi eva, in me alone. In what kind of me? Chid vyomni. Chit is the consciousness we've just spoken about. Here he uses a common expression, chit vyomna. Vyomna is a word we use, Vyoman is a word we use for space. Chit Vyoman, which becomes Vyomni due to grammar rules, literally the space of consciousness. Now, that expression has to be understood properly. Space is not consciousness, nor is consciousness space. It's a metaphor. Space, as we understand easily, space has no boundary, no limit. Space is vast, space is limitless, space is all pervasive. Therefore, chit vyomni, in the space of consciousness, could very well be translated in all pervasive consciousness. As we discussed in my translation here, pure consciousness. So space is unaffected by clouds, by pollution, by the sun, by wind. Space is unaffected by anything and everything. So that sense also, that's why I translated it here, pure. Both are true. So space is both limitless, all-pervasive, and it is pure in the sense of being utterly unaffected by anything. And those terms certainly apply to consciousness. Consciousness is all-pervasive. We discussed at great length in the Atma Bodha classes. We said that there's no boundary or edge to consciousness. Your body has a boundary or an edge, and your physical sense of sensation, touch, has an edge, has a boundary. Consciousness has no edge, no boundary, no limit. Therefore, consciousness is all pervasive. Similarly, like space is utterly unaffected by, they use terms like smoke. Smoke doesn't affect, they meaning commentators, smoke doesn't affect space. In the same way, whatever is happening in your mind doesn't affect consciousness. Again, we discussed at great length in the Atma Bodha class. We gave the example, just like the sun is not affected by what it shines upon, what it reveals, in the same way, consciousness is not affected by whatever thoughts and emotions in your mind that it illumines, that it reveals. Okay, so Mayi Chidvyomni, in me, in all pervasive, unchanging consciousness, Jagat Udeti, the world arises, Gandharva Patanam, like the Patana city, like the city of the Gandharvas. Gandharva is one of the celestial beings. So these celestial beings must have a city that they live in. Of course, this word is a metaphor. Gandharva Patanam is not literally a city of the Gandharvas. It's a not metaphor, idiom. It's an idiom that means, like, when you look at the clouds and you see a city, when you see or a palace, I think that's the English expression. When you see a palace in the clouds, when you imagine seeing some form, some object, usually like a palace or even a city. So you see a city in the clouds. The world, Jagat, is compared to a city in the clouds, meaning it's not real. You see it, but it's not real. There's a lot going on in the first half, so let's do it part by part. And a good way to proceed is to talk about what arises in Chidvyomni, in consciousness. So consider when you're dreaming. When you're dreaming, everything arises in your consciousness. A dream world arises in your consciousness every night when you dream. More than that, when you dream, that dream world, when you dream, there are trees and cars and houses and people, everything is in your dream. For that dream arises in your consciousness, that dream is sustained in your consciousness for a period of time, and when you wake up, where does that dream world go? It returns to your consciousness. So, for your dream world, you, the conscious being, consciousness, you are the creator for your dream world, the sustainer for your dream world, and the destroyer. You are Brahma, Vishnu, and Maheshwara for your dream world. More than that. Everything in your dream world is made of what? In this world, things, this chair is made of cloth. This is cloth. Here, this is made of paper, etc. So, in a dream world, everything is ultimately made of not cloth and paper, made of consciousness. The consciousness which you are is the underlying reality for everything in your dream world. For everything in the dream world, You are both the chit, we'll come back to that. You are that satyam. We used the word before. You are that underlying existence, that pure underlying reality, that pure existence because of which everything exists. Like clay is the underlying existence for a pot, like threads are the underlying existence for this cloth. You are the underlying reality that gives existence to you, everything in your dream world. One more point. Where are you with regard to your dream world? So in your dream world, if there is a car and a house, are you inside the car? Yeah. Are you inside the house? Yeah. You're everywhere in your dream world. You pervade your dream world. You pervade your dream world because it's the other way around. The dream world exists within you. I pointed out this a number of times. We say space fills this room. Space pervades this room. Space is in this room, filling this room, pervading this room. That's correct, but there's a more correct perspective. And the more correct perspective is not to say space is in this room, but it's more correct to say this room exists in space. So with regard to your dream world, we could say that your consciousness is present in every part of your dream world, but it would be better, more accurate to turn it around and say your dream world exists within your consciousness. The point is, with regard to your dream world, you are, look at the last line, you are sarva karanam. You are the karanam, the cause, the underlying reality, sarva, for everything. For your dream world, you are sarva karanam, the cause for everything. And with reference to your dream world, you are sarvagnyam. Omniscient perhaps is not the best translation. You are that all-pervasive consciousness present in your dream world, or better yet, the all-pervasive consciousness in which your dream world exists. And how real is that dream world? Remember, our definition of real is that which doesn't come and go, that which exists in the past, present, and future without change. In Sanskrit, we say trikala abaditam, that which is not negatable in all three periods of time, past, present, and future. Certainly your dream world is not real in that sense at all. It begins when your dream starts, it ends when you wake up. So your dream world is as real as Gandharva Patanam, as real as a city or palace in the clouds, which means it's experienced, but it's not real. You see that palace in the sky. You see, we see so many things that aren't real. So you can see, it really looks like a palace or a city, but there is no such thing. Okay. Then, instead of talking about the dream and dream state, how about waking state? Right now, we're not dreaming, we're awake. So in this waking state, you experience the world. But the world you experience in the most direct sense is not the world outside around you, but the world which is presented to you in your mind. Again, we've had extensive conversations about this in Atma Bodha. We've discussed how your eyes pick up information about everything you see. Your ears pick up information of sound. Your 5 senses reach out into the world, gather all that information together, and reconstruct a world in your mind. This is how sensation works. Even modern science has done a lot of study. Neuroscience has done a lot of study about how sense perception works. And they all say that in your mind, there is a recreation of the world around us. In fact, they'll often use the word model. Your mind creates a model of the world. And what you know indirectly is the world outside, but what you know directly is the world reconstructed in your mind, that model. Now, that world in your mind, what is it made of? Just like the dream world, right? The world in your mind is also made of consciousness, just like your dream world. In fact, you know, there's not a whole lot of difference between the waking world and the dream world. The significant difference is that the waking world is based on what comes from our senses. The dream world is based on what comes from memory. Other than that, there's not a whole lot of difference. Waking world comes from sense perception. Dream world comes from memory. But both of them are worlds that arise in your mind, made of consciousness, and that waking world in your mind, how real is it? Remember, our definition of real doesn't come and go, but your waking world begins when you wake up in the morning. And your waking world is sustained through the day, and then your waking world disappears at night when you sleep. So, just as you are the creator, sustainer, and destroyer of the dream world in your mind, in the same way you are the creator, sustainer, and destroyer even of the waking world of your mind. And for the waking world, you are, last line, you are sarva karanam. You are the stuff because of which that waking world in your mind, not the world outside. We haven't come to that yet. We'll come to it in just a moment. The world that is reconstructed in your mind is fashioned of what? Your own consciousness. So for that waking world in your mind, you are sarva karanam, the ultimate stuff or reality because of which it exists. And you are sarvajñam. Again, not omniscient. That's not the right translation here. Rather, jnanam in the sense of consciousness. And sarva, all. So all-pervasive consciousness is much more the sense of sarvajñam here. So you are the all-pervasive consciousness in which that waking world exists in your mind. Again, we're not talking about the outside world. We're talking about the model of the world created in your mind. That model of the world created in your mind exists in consciousness. So for the dream world and the waking world, you are sarvajñam, all-pervasive consciousness, and you are sarva karanam, the underlying reality because of which it all exists. Now, what about this outside world? You might make a distinction here, and that is the dream world and the waking world in your mind are not very real. After all, they come and go every day as you wake up and fall asleep, so they don't meet the criteria for reality, that which exists in past, present, and future. And we might contrast it with the world outside. Well, the world outside is more real than that. More real, yes. Absolutely real, no. Why not absolutely real? Well, this world in which we live had an origin, had a birth in time. According to science, it was some 13 billion years ago with the Big Bang. And in Hindu cosmology, this world is one of an endless cycle of creations. This world followed the dissolution of a prior universe. This world will eventually undergo dissolution, and this world will be followed by another universe. Kalpas, these cycles of creation. So, based on our definition of real, this world is not real. So you might want to make a distinction between the reality of the world in your mind and the reality of the world outside. Well, the reality of the world outside is more real only to a limit. The world inside your mind lasts minutes and hours. The world outside of you lasts, for billions of years, but they're both limited in time. They both come and go. Neither are absolutely real. Further, the world outside is made of what? Earlier I said cloth and paper, but what is cloth and paper? What is cloth made of? Well, we know cloth is made of threads. What are threads made of? I guess threads are made of the long fibers of cellulose, I think. What is cellulose? Molecules. What are molecules? Or proteins. What are proteins? I have to get all the science right. Some of you are quite knowledgeable. So cellulose is fibers. Fibers are made of proteins, I suppose. Proteins are made of molecules. Molecules are made of atoms. Atoms are made of neutrons, protons, electrons, which are made of quarks, which are made of who knows what. Eventually they'll go further. So remember, just not even 100 years ago, we thought atoms was the ultimate reality. There was nothing. In fact, you know that the word atom is a Greek word, atomos, that which can't be divided. They chose the word atom, that which can't be divided, and then less than 100 years ago, they divided it. And they divide it again and again and again. The point is that whatever we experience around us in the world is divisible, leading us to ask the question, what is the indivisible reality because of which the universe exists? Well, that's what we use the word Brahman for. That's Satyam Brahma, that indivisible reality because of which the divisible world exists. I'll go back to our briefly to our equivalents here. So notice the equivalence of Satyam and Sat. That Satyam, that indivisible reality, because of which the universe exists, cannot be different from the indivisible reality because of which you exist. That jnanam, the intelligence that pervades the universe, the intelligence that makes planets go around the stars, cannot be different from the intelligence manifest in your mind right now due to your consciousness. And the limitlessness of Satyam and Jnanam, the limitlessness of Brahman, the reality because of which everything exists, is the same limitlessness because of which you experience Ananda. I'll come back, there we go. Let me come back to that point. I gave the example of eating ice cream, or meditation might be a better example. Look at this. If I eat ice cream and I momentarily lose track of my body, mind, and senses because I'm absorbed in the bliss of ice cream, what's left is my true nature. If what's left is something really meager and defective and limited, wouldn't I know that? If I forget about my body, mind, and senses, what remains is my true self. If my true self is limited and defective, then that's what I'll experience when I eat ice cream. But that's not what happens. I find limitlessness when I'm absorbed in the experience of eating ice cream. Ice cream ananda. That ice cream ananda leads to limitlessness. That limitlessness is your true nature. And that limitlessness is the ananta in Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma. So notice what we've done. Two things we've done. One is we have examined our relationship to the world. The dream world arises in your mind, sustained in your mind, goes away from your mind, and you are sarvagnyam, sarvakaranam, you are all-pervasive consciousness and the underlying reality because of which your dream world exists. And it's exactly the same for the waking world recreated in your mind by your senses. For that waking world, you are sarvagnyam, you're the consciousness in which that model of the world exists within your mind. You are sarvakaranam, you are the very consciousness, the stuff, the underlying reality because of which that mental reconstruction of the world can exist. And then we come to this outer world. And what we're seeing in all three cases is all three of these worlds are Gandharva Patanam Eva. The word Eva is left out, but it's implied. Eva means like or as. Certainly the dream world is illusory, comes and goes. The waking world in your mind is equally illusory, it comes and goes. And even this world outside is illusory in both senses. First, it's not real, it comes and goes on a longer time span, but it still comes and goes. So the world is illusory in both senses. One, it comes and goes, and then secondly, it's made of something else. We use the term mithya. It's a good place to bring in that world. When we say the world is mithya, mithya really doesn't mean illusory. Mithya in this case doesn't mean false. It means false in other contexts. But here, mithya means that which exists depending on something else. This pot exists depending on clay. Clay in this metaphor is self-existent. Pot exists depending on clay. So in this metaphor, the pot is mithya. It has dependent existence. And in this metaphor, clay is satyam. Clay is not really satyam. It's in this metaphor. Clay is the satyam, the underlying reality, because of which the pot exists. And in the same way, and by the way, notice also, the pot comes and goes. The pot has a birth when a potter made it, and a pot will eventually have an end. One day I'll break it and it's finished. So the pot comes and goes, but before the pot existed, clay existed. After the pot exists, after the pot is destroyed, clay will continue to exist. So you get the idea. So clay is satyam relative to the pot. The pot is mithya, having dependent existence. And that exactly describes the relationship between the outside world and Brahman. In fact, all three worlds, we're talking about three worlds, right? The dream world, the real world, the dream world, the waking world in your mind, and the waking world outside. All three of these worlds are not independently existent. The dream world depends on your consciousness. The waking world in your mind, similarly, depends on your consciousness. And the world outside depends on Brahman. Brahman, which, according to all of our equivalences, that Brahman is not different from consciousness. Jnanam, satyam jnanam anantam brahma. So in all three cases, for the dream world, for the world that arises in your mind, and for the outside world, none of them have independent existence. All of them are time-bound, not real. They come and go. And all three of them exist depending on an underlying reality. And it's the same underlying reality because of which they all exist. Here's our equivalence. The reality because of which your dream world exists, the reality because of which the waking world in your mind exists, and the reality because of which the outside world exists, the underlying reality is the same. And that underlying reality is the truth of who you are. It is the limitless, unchanging consciousness that's present in your experience right this moment. This is the ultimate meaning of tattvam asi, is to recognize that the conscious reality, which is your essential nature, is non-different from the underlying reality because of which everything exists. This is the highest teaching of Vedanta. And that's why, based on all of these teachings, Lakshmidhara says, Ataha, in the third line, therefore, katam, how can aham, I, na Brahma? How can I not be Brahman? What a wonderful way of expressing it. When you see the equivalence clearly, how can I not be that Brahman? Of course, it takes a lot to understand that equivalence, and to understand that equivalence in two ways. Just to bring in our manana and nididhyasana, which is what this class is about. So the manana, the rational reflection, is what we've been doing this whole class, is using reasoning to understand that equivalence of satyam jnanam anantam brahma with sat chit ananda atma. That manana is meant to remove any possible doubt. And hopefully this class has helped in some measure to remove any possible doubt. But then we said that this text is meant not only for manana, but also for nididhyasana. I said that when a text is in the first person, it lends itself, it's intended for nididhyasana. So all of this entire text, just look at this one verse, it's all in the first person. Mayi, in me, chidvyomni, in the consciousness which is my true nature. Jagadu deiti, the world arises like a city in the clouds. And And it concludes, aham katamna Brahma. How can I not be Brahman? Brahman, which is sarvagnyam, that all-pervasive consciousness, and sarvakaranam, the cause of all. Aham, the first person pronoun, meaning this verse, like all the verses, is meant not just for manana, this detailed, rational process we've just been through. It's also meant for nididhyasana. How would you perform nididhyasana? Well, let me explain it. We have a few minutes. It's too late to get into the next verse. We have a few minutes left in this class, so let me explain Nidadhyasana in a little bit more detail. We discussed it in great detail in the Atma Bodha classes. You can go back to those lectures and watch those again. But for now, we've said that Nidadhyasana is necessarily preceded by dhyana, meditation. Dhyana meditation gets you ready for nididhyasana. And the way nididhyasana generally works is this. You use meditation to bring about a condition of perfect silence in your mind. Now, that's not as big a deal as you might think it is. It might seem very intimidating. But to bring about silence in your mind, not for hours, not even for minutes, just a few seconds of silence is enough. Because those few seconds of silence are enough for you to be who you truly are in the absence of anything else. Notice when your mind is silent, you have no experience of the world around you. You have no experience of thoughts. You have no experience of emotions. You have no experience of anything whatsoever. All that remains is you. A moment of silence in deep meditation is a moment in which you remain as yourself. And the purpose then, that's dhyana. Now the nididhyasana is contemplation. To contemplate, you have to, there's a more active component to contemplation. Dhyana, there's no active component. It's just resting in perfect silence. But contemplation means to reflect on that moment of silence. And in terms of this verse, look at this. We'll look at it for the last two parts. The last line, sarvagnyam, sarvakaranam. This is how contemplation would work. First, sarvagnyam. Contemplation there are different ways of doing contemplation. Here is one way, and I think this is a very helpful way of doing contemplation. You begin with a leading question. Here the leading question is, am I truly sarvagnyam? Am I truly all-pervasive consciousness? That's the leading question. Then you take up whatever meditation technique you're using, make your mind perfectly silent, and just rest in that silence for a few moments. When those few moments of silence go away, you can return to your question and inquire, during that moment of silence, was there any limitation or confinement on my nature as consciousness? Any boundary, any limit, any form, any kind of, anything that confines you. In that moment of silence, there's no boundary, no limit if there's no boundary or limit, that means what remained in that moment of silence was boundaryless, was limitless. In that way, you use that moment of silence to confirm what you already know. You have already known through Shravana and Manana that your true nature is limitless consciousness. And then in contemplation, in that moment of silence, you can confirm that truth. And then sarva karanam. It's a little harder to contemplate upon. It's a little abstract. I'm just thinking how that would work. Try this. You start with the leading question, and that is it true that my consciousness is sarva karanam, the reality because of which everything exists? Then, having posited that leading question, you practice your meditation technique, you enjoy a few moments of silence, you rest in that silence, and then after the silence, you return to that leading question. And I guess the reflection would take this form. Is there anything in that moment of silence which would disprove the fact that that my consciousness is the underlying reality because of which everything exists? Here's the point. In that moment of silence, you exist as you truly are. If there were some kind of limitation on your nature, that limitation would be apparent in that moment of silence. But in that moment of silence, there's no limitation whatsoever present. So the absence of any limitation in that moment of silence can be an experiential confirmation of the truth that your consciousness is non-different from Brahman, the sarva karanam, the underlying reality because of which everything exists. Okay, we'll conclude our class here. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhaveta, asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityor ma amritangamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om Tat Sat.